Thank you, Phil. Apologies to Phil, but I think you were getting all excited we were getting back into the detail, and now I'm going to bring us back into the more high-level overview stuff. And as solid with all of these things go, you're halfway through the day, and probably my slides have already been said a few times by everybody else. So I will try and race through the probably ones you've already heard before. Just to start us off, what is the CCSA? We are a business association formed in the UK in 2006 to represent the interests of our members in developing geological CCS wherever the opportunities exist, and also influencing policy developments in UK, EU and internationally towards appropriate regulatory frameworks. Just to make sure we say it, we are not a technical forum, environmental or a climate campaign group. So that gives you a bit of a background as to why I can't go into much technical detail. I just simply don't have it. This is a current list of our members. We are up to 66 at the moment. You may see a bit of an interesting mix of members there. We're across the whole chain of CCS, so power generation, capture, transport, storage in terms of oil and gas companies as well. We've got a large number of the service sector, so I suppose you call them the softer skills in the UK, such as law firms, banking sector, large number of consultancies, both manufacturing, engineering, etc. We've got regional agencies as well as a number of academic institutions. So quite an interesting mix, which I think makes for a very good sort of commonality in voice of trying to get CCS views across in the UK specifically. Our activities are focused on a sort of vertical slice of policy influence. So we work a lot in the UK developing appropriate regulatory and financial frameworks for CCS in the UK. We do take a very keen interest in what happens in Europe, particularly because there isn't really a CCS association in Europe. So we end up being the sort of de facto voice for a lot of CCS industry views in European legislation developments. And then we also take a keen interest in what happens in the international sphere, particularly in the UNFCCC developments. Just to point out, though, we do not get involved in what happens in specific jurisdictions. So we don't actually go in and lobby governments in other countries, which would be quite laborious anyway. I thought it might be useful to go back and give a bit of perspective as to why we're all here. CCS is a climate change mitigation technology. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the fact that we need to curb emissions. So, yes, of course, we need to have regulatory frameworks in place, and including MMV, that are very strict and ensure the safety of CCS operation and permanent storage. However, it might be helpful just to say that at the moment, when you look at fossil fuels, for example, we have 100% leakage. If you want to talk about leakage, I'd rather we didn't, but I suppose we have to. So we need CCS to try and get that 100% leakage down, essentially. So what we're really trying to do with regulations is we need to make sure that we have regulations that are clear and consistent, but that are not too prescriptive, that they actually stop CCS from fulfilling its purpose, which is to get built and to curb emissions. It's also helpful, I guess, to say at the bottom, the working hypothesis of the industry is there will be no leakage. Stores are not going to leak. I know you've heard before that there will probably be sort of low-level leakage below detection limits, etc., but it is in general the idea of the industry that stores will be selected for their very strong permanence. Leakage is actually an interesting definition. I'm not sure we mentioned this before, but actually under the EU ETS, emissions are defined as leakage to atmosphere. And there's an interesting definition which you might hear a bit later as to how leakage is defined in other directives as well. What exactly are we measuring? I thought this was a helpful slide. I've managed to find one that nobody said before, quite exciting. This is the government's estimates of 2011 provisional results for emissions, UK greenhouse gas emissions from 2011. So this is broken down into the various sectors that emissions come from in 2011. I specifically pointed out the 3 blue blobs because those are the ones that we essentially would be measuring if CCS was in place now, because that's what CCS would be capturing. So we're talking about energy supply from power stations, which is the one up there on the right, which is also the largest chunk in general anyway, at 30% I think it is. The lower one is energy supply other. It doesn't actually define other in the results, but we are sort of assuming that means energy supply from industrial sector. So that's a sort of indirect energy supply source, which CCS would be capturing as well. And the final one is industrial process emissions, which is the one at the top left at 2%, so rather low. But again, CCS is very important for industrial emissions, so it's important that we state that that is also part of the picture. And you can see on the left-hand side, the total amount that we would be capturing and therefore would be measuring and accounting for is 192.5 million tonnes of CO2. So a fair amount of emissions that we really need to account for in the whole CCS chain. Yes, I'm going to cover that later because everyone's already seen this before. Financial regulation and public perception. from an industry perspective, I guess, is the reasons we're looking at measurement and accounting for CO2. Financial, yes, sorry, I had this before. We need to account for CO2 as permanently captured and stored to achieve and receive incentives, and this is particularly the case for UK, the electricity market reform, and the current competition, which is currently going through and closing for bids in July. The EU, as I was mentioning earlier in one of my comments in the discussion, CCS gets an indirect benefit under the EU ETS because it is classed as a non-emitting installation, which means it does not have to buy allowances, unlike other emission sources. And by not buying allowances, it therefore gets an indirect benefit. However, you have to account for your CO2 under that because, as I said, if anything does happen to leak out or escape, you would need to buy allowances on the market and surrender them to account for any and all the CO2 that was to escape. Again, bless you, NER 300 competition. The NER 300 competition, which is running in the EU, also has rules by which you must account for your CO2 going through in order to receive your benefit. International mechanisms, as we heard before, CCS has finally been included in the CDM under the Conference of Parties, I think it's called, in Durban last year. Again, that means that if CCS is to gain credits through the CDM mechanism, it will need to account that the CO2 has been permanently stored. The second one I just wanted to point out, which I think Owen's covered much more detail than me, is the business case aspects. So, of course, your cost of your measurement, MMV, etc., will be factored into your business case of a project. And as Owen rightly pointed out, and I think it is important to repeat it, so I will, this should be based on your risk profile. We shouldn't just measure and put all and any measurement technology on every single project. It should be based on what is actually appropriate and sufficient for that specific site and based on the behaviour of CO2 that you're likely to see for that specific site. It's interesting to say that obviously for a lot of requirements there is an attitude that you need to prove there is no leakage, and actually that's quite a hard one to think about from a sort of a pragmatic point of view. It's quite hard to prove a negative. And you would never be able to guarantee to 100% certainty anyway that all your CO2 is where you said it was. And it's a difficult point of view to get across, but I think it's the proving the negative point that I just wanted to raise. And as Owen also said, we can obviously measure to the nth degree if we really wanted to. However, the question is really, is that financially viable for a project? And we need the technologies that are effective and not expensive to the degree that actually your project isn't able to go ahead. Regulations, again, we've talked about this before. The CCS directive covers detection of CO2, whilst the EU ETS covers quantification. It's quite interesting to note the differences and the kind of link between the two in that kind of sense. And I did a quick Control F the other day on the CCS directive, and there is not a single mention of the word measurement in the whole directive, which kind of amused me. So it is important to say that the detection in the CCS directive is, the CCS directive is where you essentially detect your CO2 if any irregularity, and if you had found an irregularity, you then have to switch to the EU ETS, whereby you would find the regulations and requirements for how you would quantify that CO2 irregularity, essentially. So again, the CCS directive, you have to account for all of your CO2 as permanently stored. And I just picked that one specific one on site handover criteria because the CCS directive sets out quite detailed requirements for how you hand over your site to the competent authority when you've finished injection and a certain period of monitoring. And measurement, MMV, etc. will be quite important to that, again, to ensure permanent storage. You won't be able to hand over your site unless you can ensure permanent storage. Also, as mentioned earlier, financial security requirements in the directive are fairly extensive, and a lot of discussion going on there at the moment. Issues within that regarding monitoring technologies, regarding injection, regarding fugitive emissions, etc. So there's quite a large number of obligations in there which you need to really think about when developing MMV tools. As I said, EU ETS, CCS is classed as non-emitting under there. So it's, again, as I was, pretty much said all that about what we're really looking at in terms of accounting across the chain will be the sort of interface between capture and transport, as in the CO2 that's accounted for within that, and again, the transport and storage interfaces to essentially verify your estimates and your modelling of each of those interfaces. Just to go into a bit more detail slightly, I think there was a slide about this earlier as well, so I won't give much detail on this. This is the CCS Directive, Article 13 on monitoring. again, large amount of details on what your requirements are around monitoring under the CCS directive, and the second one states that monitoring has to be based on your monitoring plan laid down in Annex 2. And Annex 2, again, sets out quite a number of detail around essentially establishing and updating your monitoring plan. And there's lots of detail in there around monitoring plan for capture, for transport, for storage, looking at pressure and temperature, location, technologies, best available technologies possibly. So it's just giving a bit of flavour for the fact that, yes, there are a hefty amount of requirements in there that we really need to consider when doing MMB. The MRG requirements, this is the monitoring reporting guidelines under the EU ETS. So remember, this is the complementarity, the other regulation. And because it's the quantification one, this is why I would say this one is much more detailed in terms of how you actually measure and account for CCS, CO2 in the CCS chain. The EU ETS, because you have to buy a permit as any emitting source, you need to account for the CO2 within that permit. There are monitoring reporting guidelines which allow you to account for that in the appropriate way under the requirements. And in June 2010, the Commission agreed the annex to those monitoring reporting guidelines for CCS. It's quite a lot of complicated stuff, and I've just pulled out a couple of bits of information around the kind of, I suppose you call them flowcharts and calculations you need to do to actually measure CO2 within the CCS chain, and again, how you measure concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions, either by direct measurements or by something called a mass balance approach. Particularly interesting, I think, remembering one of my early slides, the 8th annex to the CCS MRG guidelines talks about leakage from your storage complex. And again, just wanted to bring that back to what Ward was saying from the Crown Estate earlier. So we are really talking about not leakage from your actual storage site. We're talking about the wider storage complex whereby your CO2 would move into it. If it moves beyond that storage complex, that's really when EU ETS MRG guidelines kick in. Again, amusingly enough, not amusingly, sorry, however you might look at it, the emissions is really talking about here is leakage results in emissions or release to the water column. So again, emissions is what I mentioned earlier, leakage to atmosphere. However, for the purposes of the CCS MRG, they did add this wording in about release to the water column. So you can see how the emissions or leakage definition got honed down quite narrowly for CCS purposes. I think from a CCSA point of view, we put in quite a lot of detailed comments when those MRG guidelines were going through consultation, and a couple of issues which spring out at me, which I still remember going through, but may have been a bit out of date. But essentially, the MRG guidelines for CCS put in place a 1.5% uncertainty calculation for your leakage estimates, and we felt at the time that that was extremely narrow, and a lot of technologies that you might want to put in place now probably wouldn't be able to get to that degree of uncertainty calculation. And there are still discussions going on as to how that would work, and particularly for storage, we felt that it would be much harder to quantify any account for CO2 from your storage part of the chain, and discussions around how that might work for re-injection, which is really when we're starting to talk about enhanced oil recovery and enhanced hydrocarbon recovery. There are aspects there as to how that 1.5% might actually work and how you might achieve that. So kind of a few issues there to just think about. UK regulations, we've heard this before from DEC and from Crown Estate, but just to reiterate, we've got a storage licensing regime as well as a lease framework from Crown Estates, and obviously you have to account for and measure your CO2 movement, particularly beyond the storage complex. And this is particularly, as Ward was saying, in case if it moves beyond the complex, you would be able to renegotiate your lease and license. But also, I think, interestingly enough, if your CO2 moved into another licensed activity, so perhaps another oil and gas activity, for example, then there's obviously commercial negotiations that would have to take place between those two, which I think will be an interesting discussion as we kind of move forward with CCS development. Matthew was mentioning earlier, the DEC CCS roadmap was published about a month ago. A couple of complementarity documents that were published alongside this, one of which is a storage strategy, which sets out DEC's views about aspects and activities that need to be carried out going forward, one of which is looking at optimization of post-injection monitoring, measurement and verification. So there are aspects within the roadmap, and obviously there's an R&D document within that as well, which you can have a look at if you want, but has a lot more information around monitoring specifically. I just wanted to finish one slide really on a few issues just to pick out. I didn't mention public perception, and I know, berate me for putting it at the end again. But it is an issue as to how we actually account for CO2 to give public the confidence that it has actually been permanently stored. I think there's a presentation and an image point of view that we might be able to think about. There are projects that are happening. There are pilot scale projects, such as the Imperial College project that was launched not too long ago. And there are also visualization facilities that take place around the country where companies actually go down and drill into the seismic data and detail understanding of the subsurface information and data, and aspects and technologies like that I think are quite interesting and maybe a useful way of presenting the information to the public to give them the confidence that actually we do know what we're doing to some extent on the technologies here. A question about do we actually have the technologies we need? I won't be able to answer that question because, again, as I said, we don't get into the technical detail, but hoping some of the presentations today have and will do that. I think from some of the initial discussions I've had with some of our members, we seem to have a fairly good level of understanding of the technologies we need for detection of CO2. However, the quantification aspect is the real issue that we're grappling with at the moment. And I think that specifically, as we've been talking about, is the quantification of CO2 from storage. Coming back again, I think it's important to reiterate that we really do need to develop technologies that are fit for purpose. So these need to fit the risk profile of a project and the actual likelihood of what is really going to happen, the CO2 behaviour in the subsurface. Is there a need to think about developing principles of MMV, best available technologies? It's an aspect you develop for other things. We could look at what is being done in other projects. As I mentioned, Imperial, Ferrybridge project, which was launched last year, as well as Technology Centre Mungstead, which was launched last week. There are other industries as well, which obviously have a link to CCS, such as gas processing for capture and hot store recovery in the US for transport as well as for storage. So there are possibly other industries that we may look at to see how MMV is practiced over there. But obviously we need to look at those with some degree of caution, I suppose, particularly, I guess, for EOR. A lot of the onshore developments that happen over there will obviously be different from what you might be able to do offshore in the UK. And finally, just one to watch, I guess, the International Standards Organisation has kicked off a work stream to develop standards for CCS. Now, that work programme is in very early days, but you could imagine that MOV, measuring, monitoring, etc., may be quite an important stream within that. And I think that will be quite an important one to watch because it is likely that any standards on CCS that will be developed there will be applicable and will be used within the UK specifically. So that's all I wanted to say. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you, Judith.